it's no confusion, there'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. My name is Gavri'el Hakohen, and I am here with...
Hi, I'm Sadie Carpenter.
We are here to talk about the IFB cult, the Independent Fundamental Baptist cult, and I want to waste no time getting into today's episode. I'm sorry.
Sure you don't. Okay.
Yeah, I want to waste no time. Okay, if you want to know what we're on about with that, subscribe to the Patreon, because we go on a rant for like 10 minutes beforehand, and I definitely did waste time.
Nothing.
Not about absolutely nothing. We had some poignant statements in there. But anyway, I want to waste no time into getting into today's episode, because we do have a lot of ground to cover. Because this is episode 4 of our 5-part series, The First Family of Fundamentalism.
So 2 episodes ago, we talked about the later years and death of Jack Hyles and the deep grief of his congregation after their leader died.
And so Jack Hyles died in 2001. And as we discussed last time, his son David was not at all suited to take over his place due to the numerous scandals and crimes which he had committed in a very public manner.
Yes.
So Jack Hyles dies in 2001. Who is the guy who's going to take over as the cult leader?
So when it became obvious that David was no longer the top option for the job, Jack Hyles had begun grooming his son-in-law, Jack Schaap, to be like his second runner-up kind of guy. So around the time of David's scandal at Miller Road Baptist Church.
Which one was that one?
Miller Road Baptist is where he went directly after he left Hammond. That's the place with the briefcase.
With the photographs?
Yeah, place with the briefcase.
That one's skeezy.
It's all skeezy. What are you talking about? It's literally all skeezy.
That one felt especially skeezy to me.
That was the worst one to you, huh?
But yeah.
Okay.
No, that one wasn't the worst one, but that one in particular felt pretty skeezy to me.
Fair enough. But around that same time, Jack Schaap is promoted from being just a teacher at Hyles Anderson to being in an administrative role at Hyles Anderson. And then we talked about in the Battle of 1989 episode, Schaap had proved his loyalty to Hyles in a couple major ways during that time. And he was made vice president of Hyles Anderson College, and he was just in his early 30s at the time. Through
the 1990s, we see Schaap have his rank increased and his role amplified.
No, actually, Schaap remains vice president of Hyles Anderson for the next decade or so.
So he's lying in wait, basically,
exactly.
for his time to come.
Because the vice president of HAC, it's a placeholder role. It's someplace that you would put somebody who's going to rise to a position of power eventually. One theory as to why this was, people think that it's possible that Hyles was experiencing minor heart attacks for some time before the larger heart incident that caused a surgery and killed him. There's no evidence for that, but people who knew Hyles and knew his personality think that this is pretty likely.
Yeah. So is there anything in particular, though, that Schaap did to earn himself this sort of responsibility from his father-in-law?
So there are a few different things that we can gather. A couple different stories that Schaap told himself, and then there are stories that were told about him as well. The stories about him are coming from several different sources, and almost all of those people have removed themselves from the IFB. Yeah, and like I said before in this series, I'm not including stories that are just hearsay from one person. If I just read a story on an anonymous online forum, I'm not going to use it on this podcast unless I can back it up, unless there's 4 or 5 people telling the same story, or unless I know someone who has told the same story, preferably.
I mean, that's just good journalism.
Right. And if it is something that's just 5 anonymous commenters on the internet in different places said the same thing, I'll be transparent about that and say, people say, or the story is. I won't claim it as truth.
Yeah, and you never know if it could be the same person 5 times.
Right. So I try to be upfront about where I get this information. A lot of it I have a personal source for. I knew somebody who saw this thing happen. In a lot of cases, because I know so many, people from the IFB and people from the church.
You guys remember in episode 1 of this series when we told that story about how women were dropping their wedding rings in the collection plate. So actually recently we saw an account of it where it was actually described as like an extreme peer pressure situation where people were expected to sign their whole paycheck. Yeah, people were expected to sign over their whole paychecks to the church and then give away anything like jewelry, trinkets, anything that had value, and then loudly declare that they quote unquote gave it all. Like they'd shout, "I gave it all." And if you weren't doing it, you weren't like, yeah.
Right. Well, that's a great example because that story was true. People did do that thing, but it was told in a way to obscure the true nature of the horrible peer pressure that led them to do it.
Yeah. And like it eventually became like a regular thing.
Right.
I think
it was like for months
what I got
that they
that.
would have one of those Sundays every month or something like that, which just sounds awful, frankly. But that did actually happen. It was just mischaracterized. The stories that we're going to hear about Schaap, they're kind of coming from the other side. So people who personally knew him before he became pastor, people who have been telling stories about him the same way since before 2012, which is telling, as you'll find out later. And stories about himself. Withhold judgment until you see what I'm trying to say. What truths about him I'm trying to pull out of stories about himself. Just like Hyles' stories, what you say about yourself means something a little deeper than your literal words a lot of the time.
Whether or not even what you're saying about yourself is true, it still has to do with how you want people to perceive you.
Right, and how we're trying to, express what the perception of Schaap was for people who weren't there.
Yeah. So what are these stories?
So the first thing I want to bring up, I think Schaap was pliable, and I think he was willing to do things Hyles' way. So, for example, in Dating with a Purpose, which we briefly mentioned in a previous episode, Schaap tells a story about allowing Hyles to delay his plans for marriage to Hyles' youngest daughter, Cindy. In that story, Hyles said, well, you can marry her, but wait a year. And Schaap just said, okay. Schaap also taught preaching at Hyles Anderson for years, so that would mean he was using Hyles' own curriculum instead of a lot of his own opinions about preaching or pastoring. I also have a clip from one of Schaap's sermons that I want to play in a few minutes, and I think you'll notice that Schaap's preaching sounds remarkably similar to his father-in-law's. It's the tone, it's the content. He really does sound like a Hyles clone in a way.
You know what I think that I just thought of is super weird?
What?
Is that, like, you know how I talked about earlier about how Hyles was essentially cloning himself?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Hyles was essentially like making copies of himself, using his college to make copies of himself.
And
one of like the best and most successful copy of himself married his daughter.
Oh yeah. That is a detour we're going to have to take at some point.
Yeah, that's, I don't know. I just figured like.
Yeah. The IFB has a lot of very weird connotations in that department.
Very biblical connotations in that department.
It's very unfortunate. Well, anyway, you're right though and I think what we're looking at here is Hyles could not clone himself effectively in his own son, because he wanted his son to be that clone, to be that guy who took over. And when that didn't work out, he went for the next best thing, because Cindy is the youngest Hyles child, and she is often referred to as her father's favorite child. They were very close. She wrote the biography of him that I mentioned before, the very long biography of him. She wrote that. She's a talented writer, and that's what she takes after her dad. She writes kind of like him. She's a very good writer. And I think Hyles kind of did the second best thing. He went with the man who married his daughter, who he was very close to. In addition to being a Hyles clone, Schaap also proved his loyalty in a couple main ways.
So how do you do that?
Well, we told a story before from the book Profaned Pulpit by Jerry Kafitz. That was in the episode of the Battle of 1989. Schaap and Kafitz had a deep friendship and a business partnership that abruptly ended after Kafitz admitted to having read a book that was critical of Jack Hyles. There's another story other than that, where Schaap just abruptly ended a friendship. There's another story that kind of goes to show his loyalty, and it also comes from Kafitz's book, which is worth reading if you ever want to dig super deep into this. Chaffetz was present at Schaap's 30th birthday party, which was also, of course, attended by Jack Hyles and the rest of the Hyles family, with the notable exception of Beverly Hyles, but Chaffetz, along with many, many other people, say that not seeing her with the rest of the family was pretty normal. And we talked about that in the Dave episode. So Hyles had brought a present for Schaap, and in his usual kind of over-the-top mannerisms, he made a big show of a big presentation of handing over his gift. So Schaap opens up this present. It's a huge leather gun belt and holster with a .44 Magnum chrome revolver in the holster.
That's kind of a bitchin' gift, man.
I mean, or was it?
They didn't duel, did they?
No.
I feel like Jack Hyles is the type of guy who would be really into dueling.
Okay, maybe, but no. So what happens with the gun belt is Hyles starts demanding that Schaap put on the gun belt and show it off. And like in front, so it's all the friends and family there at Schaap's house. He's the host, and like Hyles is like the guest of honor because he's Hyles. And he's like, "Oh, put the gun belt on. We want to see it." So Schaap tries to put on the gun belt, but it's huge. It's like twice too big for him. And Hyles like busts out laughing, and he says, "Oh, you're going to have to wrap it around twice, Jack." I mean, Jack Hyles is mocking Schaap, who had like a 29-inch waist at the time. Schaap always gave the impression of being taller and thinner than he actually was. So it's almost like an Abraham Lincoln build, if that makes sense. Like he looked taller and ganglier and skinnier than he really was. And he always used to call him scrawny. Hyles was derailing Schaap's milestone birthday. So Hyles just like decides out of nowhere to just mock Schaap in front of everybody. He'd purposely chosen a gift that would give him an opportunity to humiliate Schaap and make his birthday party all about himself instead. So Schaap just was, what might be worse is Schaap just submits to this behavior. Like there are countless examples. If you just fished through a bunch of sermon tapes of Hyles, you would find so many examples of Hyles mocking, humiliating, generally using Schaap as his verbal whipping boy. So Hyles did this to everyone on his staff, just about, but Schaap was one of his favorite people to pick on. So even in that book by Jerry Chaffetz, there are other stories about Schaap just allowing Hyles to mock him and generally run his life. But I think I've made my point. Hyles was confident that Schaap would do whatever he told him to do.
So basically, like if you let Jack Hyles treat you terribly, you're essentially paying dues for when he wants to put you in the driver's seat.
Right. Letting Hyles bully you is a way that you gain status. I think what Hyles wanted was a ministry that would outlive him, like a church that still functioned after his death the same way that it did when he was alive, with very few changes. Really, the way that it was set up, anybody that Hyles groomed or anybody that Hyles asked to be the next leader would jump at the chance. So Hyles could have anybody he wanted, and he was looking for a specific type of man. You know, someone with the charisma and the hard-headedness to do what Hyles had done and keep the place on track and keep the place in line, but also someone who would submit to Hyles' way of doing things so that the Hyles way would live on.
So like I said, I have speculated and continue to speculate that Jack Hyles was a narcissist. But one of the things that like I've read is a quality of narcissists is the desire to quote unquote live forever, because basically they believe that they are greater than normal humans. In death, everybody is equal. So one of the ways that they can say, oh, I'm better than and greater than everybody else is to be like, I will never die. One of the ways that they accomplish this is by founding institutions or things or whatever that are named after them that like are there to glorify them. Anyway, so like we get to 2001 and Jack Hyles has died from heart disease, and the congregation deeply mourns his passing. And I take it that Jack Schaap is a shoo-in to be his successor.
I think the best answer to that, I wanted you to hear this video. It's Schaap's sort of job interview sermon for the people of First Baptist Church. In the sermon, if you listen to the whole thing, which I don't suggest, you would hear him say that it's about 2 weeks after Hyles' death. So I picked a clip for you. The first voice that you'll hear is Johnny Colston. He's introducing the speaker, and then you're going to get to hear the crowd reaction to being told that Schaap will be preaching for them that morning.
Johnny Colson's the guy who said he'd drink the poison, right?
Yes, that's the guy. So his job was he would always read the scripture. So his job, he would like get up, read the scripture, say a prayer, and then the pastor would start their sermon. So in this case, he's reading the scripture and then introducing the guest preacher because Brother Hyles is dead. So he's introducing Jack Schaap.
Please turn in your Bibles to the 8th chapter of Romans, beginning with verse 26 in your Schofield Reference Bible, page 1202, 1202. Brother Schaap is preaching for us this morning. He's just one of the best young men in the nation today. A good preacher, a very sound Bible doctrine teacher, and just as someone we just could not very well do without.
So you heard the congregation applaud when Schaap was introduced. And that was a really, really unusual reaction for a regular service. That's not something that was done in this church.
Wow, they are clapping like they are singing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot on a bus or at a teen service.
Yes. And again, like this is super atypical. I think you hear from that, these people are hoping that Schaap will be their next pastor. They're really hanging on every word that he's about to say to them. You also hear Colston go on for quite a few seconds there, praising Schaap. So not only is the crowd super eager to hear Schaap speak, you've also got this familiar voice in Brother Colston, someone who worked closely for Jack Hyles, and he's praising Schaap to the crowd.
And so I assume that they vote him in.
Yeah. So we talked about the grief that the people at Hyles Anderson and First Baptist felt when Hyles died, and how lost they felt. And it was made clear to them that Schaap was the person whom Hyles had chosen to succeed him. So they voted him in as pastor with a 96% to 4% margin.
I wonder if those 4% knew something that we don't.
Well, you can find 4%ers, as they call themselves now, speaking about things now in 2020, but that's a story for a little bit later.
So when this happened, you're like 7, 8 years old. Like, what do you remember from this time?
So I had literally just turned 8 because Hyles' funeral was on my 8th birthday. I don't remember too much about Schaap's super, super early years. I knew that my father had gone to college with him, and I knew who he was kind of peripherally. I knew that there were some IFB pastors who didn't like Schaap and didn't support him being pastor, but it was kind of brushed off. So at the time, what would have been said about that is those people are still grieving. They wouldn't like anybody who wasn't Hyles himself come back from the grave.
Huh.
Right. So it was played off as like, oh, no, they're grieving. They just miss Hyles. They wouldn't like anybody.
Okay, so basically from here on forward, this is all stuff that you don't really have to dig into outside sources for, because this is stuff that you actually personally remember happening. Right.
Well, what's really the thing is from here on out, I only get closer to the story. So if you think of it like the analogy of a stadium concert, Schaap taking the position of pastor at First Baptist, I saw that like from the 300s level in a stadium concert. By the end of Schaap's story, it's things that I saw like I was in the second row.
When I was 7, my first rock concert was Ringo Starr and the All-Star Band.
Oh, that's cool.
Sheila E. played the drums. That was very cool. But when you were 7, your first rock concert was church sermons.
Yeah. So when I was 8, 7, week of my 8th birthday, my rock star hero died and another one took his place. And just to complete that analogy, by the end of this story, if I had been one step closer, I would have pretty much had a backstage pass.
And knowing what we know about the habits of IFB pastors, I think it's probably a good thing that you didn't have a backstage pass.
True that.
I assume that Schaap's ministry runs pretty much the same manner as Jack Hyles.
So in the first half of his pastorate, Schaap very much continues to act like a Hyles clone.
So he's like giving these sermons, he's publishing books.
Yes. So Schaap uses Hyles' publications to his advantage. Hyles was known for being a prolific writer. He wrote dozens of books. He wrote manuals on church work and books about theology, books about doctrine and poetry and personal stories. He just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, dictated all of these books. And Schaap continues that tradition. So he used Hyles publications to publish his own books. He also pressured his wife, Cindy, to write her own books and have those published through Hyles publications. Schaap also solicited manuscripts from other people on staff. He really tried to build up Hyles publications in those early years.
So it's just like how in the 1990s he wrote that excellent dating manual, Dating with a Purpose.
Yes. So Schaap was publishing, his thoughts before he even became pastor with Dating with a Purpose.
Publishing books became a major source of income for the church.
The church, or the Hyles estate of whom his wife was a part, or himself, or who really knows. Because just exactly like we talked about with Hyles, it's really unclear exactly where the money went with the Hyles publications stuff. Anyway, Schaap made a controversial move with Hyles publications in 2006. He opened a coffee shop and bookstore on the church campus so that there would be a brick and mortar location for Hyles publications to try to drive sales up.
How is this controversial?
Oh, sorry. So a coffee shop is controversial because to these IFB preachers, this comes off as liberal. Like a non-denominational church might have a coffee shop in their church.
Or maybe they were secretly all watching Friends and they're like, that's where Rachel works.
No, so Schaap's focus from 2001 to 2006 really seemed to be building up First Baptist Church and building up their own ministries like Hyles Publications and other things. So towards the end of those years, Schaap makes some other changes. He sets up a church website. He improves the graphic design on flyers and things that are passed out by the church. And then he also builds a hugely expensive, very on-trend, modern-looking new church auditorium. So all of this kind of seemed to set off the old guard IFB people, and he was accused of modernism because by modernism they mean any update at all to his church and anything that Jack Hyles never did.
I'm still having so much difficulty here envisioning a world where having a coffee shop and a bookstore is somehow controversial.
So Schaap also lost a lot of popularity because of the new auditorium he built. The new building was far more expensive than the church could actually afford. And even after he solicited millions of dollars from large donors like Russell Anderson and Jack DeCoster, who helped build Hyles Anderson, the church found themselves deep in debt by the time that the new auditorium was unveiled at Pastor School 2006.
So I can't imagine this going well, because every time I watch a crime movie, whenever they find themselves owing somebody some money, they always have to do something really shady to get out of it.
Oh my God, I totally forgot that part of the story. So now that you mention it, there was a certain insurance company started through First Baptist Church around this time.
Oh my God. So wait, what kind of insurance were they? Were they selling soul insurance? Like if you don't get into heaven, they'll pay out $1 million to your next of kin?
No, this was pretty much just a straight up Ponzi scheme that benefited the guy who ran it and also paid dividends to Schaap.
For me, this is less surprising than David Hyles continuing to be a predator literally everywhere that he goes.
Yeah.
But this doesn't seem like enough to get them out of debt, because they are literally bleeding their members dry for decades. So how are they going to continue to generate revenue?
I mean, I agree that the members are already kind of done as much as they can do. Like all the wedding rings that are going to be sold have been sold. And Schaap has a lot of influence, but he is no Jack Hyles when it comes to those crazy fundraising methods. So another thing that Schaap does in the second half of his pastorate, so starting around 2006, is he pivots his focus to missions. So you're going to have to follow me through some logic here, but I really think there's a potential financial motive at the end of this. Schaap invents, or maybe claims to invent, I'm not sure, the idea of team missions. And this is something that I was literally actually there for. So at Pastor School 2006, the same year that they are showing off the giant fancy new auditorium that they owe millions of dollars on, Schaap has this big focus on missions. And there are all these heartrending messages every night. And Schaap introduces the first missions team that First Baptist Church will send. So instead of sending one family all alone to the missions field, Schaap has this idea that he can hand pick multiple families and send a team of 30 or more people to the same place. So they often pick like a difficult, quote unquote, difficult mission field like China or Ghana. And that allows this team to work together and start a church on the missions field more quickly because they've got more hands on deck.
So isn't it highly illegal to be a missionary in China?
Yes, it is. And I know a lot of things, and I'm going to choose to say a few things on this particular recorded episode of our podcast.
Yeah, so while China's general unwillingness to tolerate freedom of religion is a huge problem, they should definitely not be uprooting families and sending them to dangerous places where they might get into political trouble from doing this. Like, it's super illegal there to do this. Like, they're sending people there it's...
Well, yeah, and I know for a fact that at least at one point they were sending families with small children.
What the
Did you just bleep yourself?
Good
did. Job.
I did.
But what I can say is First Baptist has a very creative way of getting around places where they're not supposed to be missionaries. And they have ways of getting coded information out of places where there are not supposed to be missionaries. And what I can also say is like this lent an air of urgency to certain of these missions teams. So that brings me to part of the point that I want to make.
They're like sending people there on purpose because they think people will give them more money?
Yes.
Yes,
because you send people to bad places, quote unquote, or dangerous places, or these people are going to have to basically be spies in other countries, and these people are going to have a very dangerous job, and if they get caught, they're going to get thrown into jail. Oh, Spies for Jesus is a whole thing, man. It's a whole thing. I can't even start. But it lends urgency. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, number one, if you're a regular old family at First Baptist Church, or like a regular couple graduating from Hyles Anderson, if Schaap called you into his office, which he did, and ask you, so say you're graduating from Hyles Anderson and you actually just want to be like an assistant pastor and your wife wants to be a Christian school teacher. Schaap could call you in his office one night after church and say, you guys are engaged. Well, I want you to join my missions team to Thailand, and husband's going to be an assistant pastor in Thailand and wife can be a teacher in Thailand. It's seen as like a high honor for Schaap to handpick you like that. And you could be pressured into joining this missions team, although neither one of you ever intended to be a missionary to begin with.
And you couldn't say no.
I mean, you could, but then, if you turned down a missions team, you might have trouble finding work at another IFB church because you turned down something that Schaap as the pastor asked you to do.
It sounds more like getting picked for the Hunger Games than it does.
So, yeah, again, I'm not going to say everything that I know on this particular episode, but I know that there were small children sent to China and sent to Ghana, other unsafe places. And yeah, if Schaap picked you, you did feel absolutely obligated to go. I know of one man who had a successful construction business in the U.S. who was asked to give it up and go to Ghana so he could build church buildings there.
So how does this make the cult money?
There are two ways that I think this was financially benefiting the church. So not only does Schaap need many more missionaries to be willing to send wherever the heck he tells them to go, he also needs much, much, much more money to send all of these extra missionaries. So this new and exciting idea of team missions that Schaap invented allows Schaap to ratchet up the fundraising and really pressure people to give money to missionaries. So an unconfirmed source, but seemingly solid, that I saw claims that Schaap raised as much as $7 million yearly for missions. Yeah. So pastor schools and youth conferences became extreme high pressure recruiting seminars. So they would not just ask you to give money for people who were about to join them. They would parade these mission teams out on stage and make them stand there while they took up an offering for them. And so not only are you being extremely pressured to give money to these teams, you're also being pressured to quote unquote surrender to be a missionary. So with this extreme high pressure, you get more kids and more young adults who are giving into that pressure, who are, quote, giving their life to God or surrendering to God's call. So I'm going somewhere with this. But I want to tell you what happened to me first before I make my grand conclusion here.
Okay.
So I was at a pastor school, and I think it was either 2006 or 2007. So I was 13 or 14. And the big push at the end of the conference was to get everyone to sign these little cards saying that you would give 2 years of your life to be a missionary at some point. I don't think I can properly describe the pressure that was on me at that age. Schaap had everybody who was signing this card go to the front and stand kind of shoulder to shoulder on the steps of that big platform at First Baptist Church. And of course, I went to the front and signed a card. So actually, fun fact, one of our listeners was in my church group, and I know that I stood right next to him at the front of the auditorium, so he might know who he is. Schaap had us all stand on the steps so we could like have our picture taken, and then also like they would know who was up there, and they could like contact you later. I lived for years in like terrible, sickening guilt that I had signed that card and never followed through on it. Until I realized how completely horrendous and unethical it is to coerce a 14-year-old child to sign years of their life away on a contract that's not a legal contract.
Right. And I mean, you told me that your dad sort of pulled you aside and said, I'm not sure you know what you're like getting yourself into. Maybe you shouldn't do this.
Yeah, he did. And I thought in my brainwashed mind that he was like testing my commitment to God. Turns out he was just trying to remind his actual literal child that I was legally, ethically, and morally too young to sign any kind of contract.
Thank God somebody in the IFB had the slightest bit of common sense.
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't me that had that common sense. But what do you expect from a 14-year-old who's, crying so hard I could barely stand because I'm also sleep deprived and running completely on coffee. And
coffee and mayonnaise?
Coffee and Mountain Dew.
You mean Mountain Moo?
No, I do not. No, I survived those weeks on like coffee, Mountain Dew, and Atomic Fireball candies because they're like super spicy and they'll keep me awake. I went through these weeks like I'm away from home. I'm sleep deprived. I haven't had a proper meal in a week. And I've had images of like starving children pumped into my brain all week. So of course I went and signed a card. It's coercive. It's terribly abusive and coercive, the way that they set these things up. Well, the thing is that all of these people who signed those little cards or gave their life to God during these high-pressure tactics at Schaap's missions conferences, turns out all of those people need to go to Bible college to prepare for eventual missions work and to find a spouse who will be your partner in your missions work. So how do you think that turned out? So
you're sending a bunch of teenagers to Hyles Anderson?
Yeah, so Schaap was trying to ramp up Hyles Anderson admissions. Because remember, Hyles Anderson is another golden goose. Because the textbooks for Hyles Anderson come almost entirely from
Hyles Publications?
Right, from Hyles Publications.
Yeah, so this is like the same scam as professors assigning their own books as required reading.
Uh-huh.
Like Gilderoy Lockhart.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it seems like, wow. So Jack Schaap is just running the same exact grift as Jack Hyles, except on a larger scale because he's more desperate for money.
Right. So Schaap is making money two ways out of this, right? Because he's fundraising for the missionaries, and then he's getting all these more people at Hyles Anderson and like reinvigorating Hyles Anderson's missions program. And then he's also soliciting donations for the missionaries from Hyles Anderson kids.
This is burning the candle at both ends there.
Yeah, exactly. So the rest of the money, Schaap tried to grift it from large-scale donors like Russell Anderson, who co-founded Hyles Anderson, also Jack DeCoster, who is a chicken farmer from Iowa, who donated a lot of money to Hyles Anderson in the early days. Both men were friends of Hyles, and they both supported Schaap in the beginning. But just as the recession hit and everyone was on financial hard times, Schaap managed to do something that ticked off not only his large donors, but also about half of fundamentalism.
So what did he do? Because this seems like an inopportune time. Maybe he should have kept his mouth shut.
Yeah, I agree. Schaap's not good at that. You'll find out later. More later. So
what did he do?
Well, so what Schaap did, he had a different and, if I can say, more reasonable view on the King James Bible version than some other IFB preachers did.
So knowing what I know about the IFB, I'm going to say that anything that's more reasonable is probably from the devil.
That would be bingo. Yes. So My explanation is going to be vastly oversimplified because I don't want to bore 90% of the audience to tears. The IFB position at the time, and still, so there are a couple things you need to understand. Number one, that God verbally inspired the Bible when it was spoken word by word into the ears of the original scribes. And then those guys wrote it down by hand, word for word, exactly what God said. So literally, they believe that God spoke every word of the Bible to Moses, to David or Daniel or John or Paul or whoever. And then those guys wrote down word for word exactly what he said. And this is called the doctrine of verbal inspiration. So that's inspiration. The other doctrine about the Bible is preservation. So the IFB believes that God preserved the Bible miraculously. Most Christians take this to mean that when it was copied down by other scribes who shared it with then other people, that God miraculously helped them to make sure that it got transcribed correctly.
Hold on. So this means that literally every Bible translation is correct?
No, quite the opposite. So the Bible gets compiled into the canonical books, which is meant exactly the same way that you might say, like, is Batman versus Superman canon or not? The early church decided, again, with God's miraculous guidance, which books are in and which books are out. 1,000 years after that, we're at the point where the Bible is first translated into English by John Wycliffe.
Oh, I know him. So he's from Fugees, right?
What?
Yeah, the hips don't lie with Shakira.
I just didn't know that the Bible translation guy was a time traveler, apparently.
I think he's Haitian, right? Yeah, he's Haitian. I think he ran for president of Haiti.
Okay, I seriously have to look this up now. Anyway, the historical John Wycliffe used the Latin Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the scriptures that was currently being used by the Catholic Church. He used that Latin translation to translate the Bible into English for the first time ever in English. So there are years and years worth of controversy about the several Greek versions in the Latin Vulgate that were in use at the same time. You could literally do an entire podcast on that. I'm going to restrain myself for time. The end of the story is English-speaking Christians who were not Catholics wanted to be able to read the Bible in their language. So a version was commissioned by King James of England, who was definitely gay, by the way.
Super gay.
King James? Oh my God. Super, super gay. Anyway, King James assembled scholars who could speak both Greek and Latin and English, and most of them could use about 6 or 7 languages. And with the guidance of Wycliffe's English translation that was made a few hundred years before, and using original Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic texts, and using the Latin Vulgate, they put all of this information together to translate what we have now as the King James Version, which was completed in 1611. So here's the controversy. We made it. We did it. That's it. We did it. That was it. So it turns out many IFBs believed and still believe that God re-inspired the King James Version translators when they worked on the King James. So remember, inspiration is interpreted as God speaking into someone's ears and literally telling them what to say. So this faction of the IFB believes that God didn't just help or assist the King James translators in getting it right, that God was more involved than that God actually told them in English in their ears what words to use when they made this translation.
What?
Well, Schaap said that's ridiculous. God helped the King James Version translators, aka doctrine of preservation. God helped them make sure they got it right, but God didn't re-inspire the King James Version. The Bible was inspired when it was written the first time, when God spoke it into the ears of the original guys that wrote it down, Daniel and Moses and those guys. So Schaap actually has a more reasonable view, because these IFBs are saying that God spoke it again into the ears of the King James translators. Anyway, Schaap's view does make more sense, but it caused all hell to break loose on Jack Schaap from his IFB pastor contemporaries. But we've talked before about the IFB and the need to separate from people who hold different doctrinal opinions than you. So, predictably, a large section of the IFB began to feel the need to separate from Jack Schaap. This meant lower pastor school attendance, lower Hyles-Anderson attendance, and protesters outside of pastor school, all kind of crazy stuff.
A protest over this?
Yeah, there were protesters outside of pastor school. I was, again, this is something I was there for. I was actually there when there were protesters. No, dude, sandwich signs, costumes.
This is such nerd.
There was a brawl in the alley between the old auditorium and the new auditorium.
They got into a fight over this?
There was
Dear,
a brawl
oh my
with
God.
Hyles Anderson, like preacher boys and these protesters. It was messy. Anyway. So I know like this Baptist drama is like super niche to explain. But
this is so weird.
I know, but it does turn out being important.
It's like, to me, like, this makes no sense to me.
Well, the root of this drama is a little bit important because what this is showing us, Schaap as Hyles' successor and as the de facto leader of the IFB, Schaap wanted to move the IFB into a more modern, relatable direction. The coffee shop, totally new concept of missions, the better graphic design, the using a website, and now this whole like KJV controversy. These are all ways in which Schaap was trying to be more modern, which came off as liberal. So Schaap even began to associate with pastors of, oh no, non-denominational churches. Schaap was single-handedly trying to bring the IFB kind of if you can think of like, Schaap is trying to get 1 foot of the IFB into the 21st century. And people were not happy about that.
Well, you can't bring people into the 21st century if they're still in the 19th century.
Well, that's what Schaap was trying to do, though. He wanted to have 1 foot planted in the 19th century with all the old beliefs, with the racism and the misogyny and all that good stuff. But he also wanted his other foot, metaphorically, in the 21st century, with the trendy building, with the on-trend color scheme, with the slick graphic design, with his coffee shop and his associating with non-denominational pastors and his less extreme views on the King James Bible. Does that make sense, like, what he's trying to do?
Yes.
Yeah, he's trying to do both. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. He also, like, he wanted this church to look, like, modern and fun because he wanted to attract, like, more young people. And the reason that this is really important in the grand scheme of understanding the IFB movement is that all of this birthed the new IFB. So now in 2020, we are pretty much dealing with 2 separate groups, the old IFB and the new IFB. The new IFB are people that Schaap made mad. That's, again, an oversimplification. We'll do an episode one day.
I was going to say that this like clearly sets him apart from Jack Hyles, but I can't help thinking that causing theological controversies is pretty much on par for everything that the IFB does. Yeah.
One of the big issues here is that Hyles was a big part of why the King James Version was so revered among the IFB. The King James Version was one of Hyles' sticking points, even like one thing that he really had against other denominations. Hyles actually had a friend breakup with a close preacher friend because that friend sat on a committee about a new Bible translation. People in the IFB were ridiculously attached to Hyles. We're talking about just 5 or 6 years after his death. I mean, I used to go to conferences and sit in the row behind. There was a church called Hyles Baptist Church. I mean, there are also churches called King James 1611 Baptist Church. They're so attached to both Jack Hyles and the King James Version. So Schaap is basically seen as spitting on Hyles' grave with every change that he makes, but especially with this King James Version thing. So all of these people who are super, super close to Hyles, who already resented Schaap for being the guy who took over for Hyles, are done with him.
So if this is what passes for modern in the IFB, I've got to ask, did he make any changes to the IFB's history of like sexist doctrine or being repressive towards women? Because I feel like that's, if you're going to modernize, that should be like...
Yeah, about that. So that's the second part of the Schaap controversy.
Hey, Gavri'el here. If you enjoy the Leaving Eden podcast, head over to our Facebook group, Eden Exodus, where you can talk to other fans, ask us questions, and share memes. That's facebook.com/Eden Exodus. You can join our Patreon at patreon.com/Leaving Eden Podcast, and you'll get access to extended and uncensored episodes. You can also support our show by recommending it to your family and your friends. The Leaving Eden Podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. And now, back to the show.
So we've talked about him like getting all of this antagonism from inside the IFB about the KJV and other modern things. The other half of this is about attention that he gets from outside the church over some now famous comments about women and sexuality. So this is where it gets really weird. Remember, we talked about Schaap is trying to have one foot in the old times and one foot super modern. Well, the foot that was in the super modern times got him in trouble with the old IFB people. The foot that he wanted to still have in the 19th century is about to get him in trouble with, people who are not IFB. So in 2005, Schaap published a book called Marriage, the Divine Intimacy.
I'm intrigued, but this sounds low-key horrifying.
Yeah. So Schaap published quite a few books on marriage. It was one of the things he was supposedly an expert on, which is a little bit interesting because that's one of the things that Hyles rarely talked about. Hyles wrote one 50-page pamphlet on marriage, and that's it. And Schaap writes all these books about it. But anyway, in this book, Schaap made some really gross and twisted claims about what a godly marriage looks like.
If I am a good Christian boy and I have gone to Hyles Anderson College, and through the grace of God, I have met a beautiful young woman who is within 3 years of my own age through a teacher who set us up together. According to Jack Schaap, what do I need to know about having a godly marriage?
Okay, so number one, you need to be as familiar with God's commandments as you are with your wife.
Check.
In a sexual sense. So here's the quote from the book. This is from Divine Intimacy. Psalm 119:30 says, I have chosen the way of truth, thy judgments have I laid before me. That word laid is a sexual term which literally means the same thing as a man laying with a woman. God was saying that God's laws should be as intimate as a marriage partner in a sexual liaison. End quote. There.
So, what, what? Wait, so basically they're, yeah, so basically what they've done is they've said, okay, well, in English, these two words have the same meaning.
No, Schaap claimed that the Hebrew word that is translated in the King James as laid is a sexual term in Hebrew. That's what Schaap claimed.
I don't know whether or not that's true, but I am 100% sure that that's wrong.
I've heard him say that in person.
If Jack Schaap said it, there is a 100,000% chance that is not true.
And I've heard him say that in person, not just in this book. This is something he harped on a bit.
Let me find my book. Sorry.
Oh no, go for it.
Okay. So it's Psalm 119:30.
Yep.
119:30. Here's what it says in the Jewish Publication Service version, which is
this is your holy book, and this is what your people have to say about it. So I take that pretty seriously.
This is what it says. I have chosen the way of faithfulness. Thine ordinances have I set before me.
Yes, set is not real sexy.
This is literally just I think this word, this is the translation to English. Well, in English, this word also means this word. So I'm going to use that to it's like playing. Did you ever watch, what was it? There was what show was it? There was a TV show where there was a joke that they were playing some game show called Homonym.
Oh, that sounds like Parks and Rec, but I don't know. That sounds like something they would say on Parks and Rec.
It might have been, yeah. I can't remember what TV show it was when they would be like,
somebody will email us and tell us what it is.
Yeah, there was Homonym. They were playing some TV show, some game show called Homonym, where they would be like, which one is it? It's this one or this one? And they'd say they're like, no, it's the other one.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, if you know what we're talking, that's how this seems to me. This is just such.
If you know what TV show that is, email us.
Please do, or just DM me on Instagram or something.
Yeah.
That's what level of nonsense this seems to me.
Well, okay, listen to the next one. I hope you still have your book open. So,
okay.
Same page of Schaap's book, he says, in the next verse, David gets more graphic. I have stuck unto thy testimonies, O Lord, put me not to shame. That word stuck means the act of a man entering his wife. It is sexual intercourse. God says that still quoting Schaap, God says that the word of God should be the Christian's lover, and nothing should be closer to him than the Bible. The words of God are supposed to be the most intimate lover of his life.
Okay, so this is what it says. It says, I cleave unto thy testimonies. Oh Lord, put me not to shame. Cleave, I guess cleave could be sexual if you want to get like super raunchy, but
well, you wouldn't know this, but like when Jesus talks about marriage, therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and cleave unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. I think Jesus quotes that, and I think it's originally in Genesis, but Jesus does like a callback to it.
okay.
But it is, I mean, it is a word that's used to refer to marriage, but I don't have any reason to think it's as sexy as Scott says it was.
This all seems like a bunch of absolute nonsense.
I mean, it is. So Scott goes on to say, he says that receiving Christ as Savior is equivalent to, quote, spiritual intercourse. He says that we receive Christ as lover. And then he also says that when a wife, quote, receives her husband, gag, she is receiving Christ. So that sex within Christian marriage is a type of spiritual communion.
So I'm not going to lie. Spiritual intercourse sounds like something that you might hear in like a Prince song.
Oh, sure.
Like one of his like really artsy, slow, like R&B slow jams.
Oh, yeah. And I don't have a problem with that. It's just that
I might actually make a song called Spiritual Intercourse. That sounds kind of...
You know what? You go for that.
Yeah.
But for these IFB people, though, like these people take their sexual purity extremely seriously. So the suggestion of God as a sexual being was simply appalling to these people. And in my opinion, I think...
Provocative.
Really. And it made a lot of people very, very mad.
I don't doubt it.
So I think this is Scott testing the waters of how sexual he could get away with being from behind the pulpit.
So by this time, like he starts delivering these sermons, like you're a young adolescent girl. So how do you feel like these, like, do you feel like these ideas had any particular effect on you? Like you told us that you were like 16 and in the audience for the Polished Shaft sermon.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Divine Intimacy came out when I was 12. So of course I wasn't allowed to read it. I wasn't allowed anywhere near it. I heard kind of whispers of what was in it, but I didn't really experience like that particular backlash. But I do think that book, like that was Scott testing the waters, because after this, he becomes more and more sexual in preaching. And there are several sermons that I was actually there for that I feel are a direct result of this. So the first one, it wasn't Scott. I'm not sure what the conference was, but I think it was Lady Spectacular or Pastor School. And I think it was 2006, but I could be way off on that one. Honestly, I was so embarrassed and like mortified by this whole thing that I do not know what year it was. But I was at this conference where Tom Williams, who is a friend of Scott's, preached an extremely sexual sermon to an audience of all female attendees. So basically this sermon was just like Cosmo, but from the 80s and with a heavy dose of, you have to do this to your husband because of Jesus. So it was like the standard IFB line of like, don't ever turn your husband down for sex no matter what.
That's a standard line?
Oh yeah. That goes all the way. What? That goes all the way from like the Duggars to like the IFB to like Amish, like that, like, there are lots of groups, and I won't say all Amish, but some Amish communities. There are groups all over the board of Christian fundamentalists who believe this. Even like more quote unquote modern, like pants wearing Christian fundamentalists, Southern Baptist women. Like you can hear this all sorts of places is what I'm saying. But it's that, but it's also like tips on what kind of lingerie men like. IFBs are like super obsessed with lingerie. It's a thing. And it was like this sermon, I wanted to die as a teenager.
Because it represents sexuality, like in a visual sense. Like,
right. And also because you're in a culture where you wear floor-length denim skirts. And right. Like, so that's like the sexiest thing they can think of.
As a teenager, you don't like, you're hearing this, you don't know anything about sex, right, except that if you do it and you're not married, you end up in hell.
Well, you get pregnant and die like Mean Girls.
So it's got to be really, really weird to have this preached at you in church.
Right. Like, I mean, there like, and Scott would use like sexual terms from the pulpit that I did not know how to define. I didn't know what he was talking about. And so like, as you know, the first messaging I'm getting about sex at all is it hurts. It's not going to be fun for you most of the time, and you have to do it anytime your husband wants to. Oh, and also you have to be like a wild sex vixen to please your husband, or he will cheat on you and it'll be your fault.
Oof.
Yeah, so that's like the messaging that I'm getting. Yeah, it's a lot. So the next like super sexual sermon is way worse. I'm sorry to tell you.
Worse?
Oh, dude, it's like 10 times worse than what I just described. I know. So I was in a teen session at Ladies Spectacular, and I would have been 16, so October of 2009, I believe. So Scott comes in to preach directly to the teenage girls.
Oh, no.
Yes. Oh, yes.
This is going to be bad.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, it is. So I've mentioned before that he has gained all of this star power. Like, he has charisma, a lot like his father-in-law did. And I remember, like, hundreds of teenage girls in this room standing and cheering when he came in. It was completely like being at a concert. So he smiled and waved to all of us, and it was like the highlight of our week that he came in to speak to just us teenage girls.
Just the ladies.
Just the minor ladies.
This is a song for the ladies.
This is a song for the ladies under 18.
If you're under 18.
I know. It's gross. So Scott's topic for the day, when he's going to speak to this audience that is full of minors, he decided to preach on dress code and modesty. Scott gets up in front of, this is probably a CW worthy, by the way. It's just plain gross.
Yeah.
Scott gets up in front of this room full of girls, and for his entire sermon, all he talks about is the quote, bad things that we teenage girls wear and how they cause temptation to him and how they cause temptation to other men. So specifically, I remember him talking about tight skirts, how our teenage legs are so sexy, and that if our skirt is too tight, it's a temptation to him.
Ew.
And he's talking to a group of teenagers. There are very few. There are maybe 3 adults in this room with him and hundreds of teenage girls. So I remember him talking at length about. So this is 2009. So people were wearing like those little like silk tank top camisoles with like lace trim at the top. It was like a layering thing that people wore.
Yeah.
It was a thing. And we always had to wear tank tops under our shirts to like make our neckline high enough for dress check. And so those like silky kind of ones were really popular. Scott went on and on about how those look just like lingerie, and he tells this very detailed story about a teenager who bent over to have him sign her Bible and what exactly he saw when he, quote, accidentally, I'm doing the world's biggest air quotes, accidentally looked down her shirt.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know this is really, really freaking gross. I'm really sorry.
Yeah. And how old is he at this point? He was born in what, 1950?
He was born in he's around Dave's age, I think. So he's probably 50 or just about to be 50, maybe.
Ew.
In 2009, 52, I think, maybe.
Ew.
Yeah. No, this is gross. And then the same night, if not the same night, then like the next night, Scott rehashes his divine intimacy stuff for all the ladies at the ladies conference in the evening session. So children and teenagers and adults, which is even more awkward because I happened to be sitting with Richard's mom at the time. So I'm sitting with the mom of the boy I'm kind of casually saying, and Scott is going through all this like sexual stuff, and I don't know what he's talking about. And it was so uncomfortable. Just literally like one of the most uncomfortable moments of my life.
Wow.
So all this to say, though, I think it's super clear by 2009 that Scott is not thinking in a way that is pure in any sense of the word.
Well, so I know enough about the IFB to have some sort of picture about where this is headed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Ugh.
I also want to point out that he said like these more explicit things when he was the only man in a room full of hundreds of women. So I want to know what you think about this, because to me, it comes off as both kind of an exhibitionism thing, and it comes off as like a major dominance power play kind of thing. Like, so I was there, and my perception really truly is, I think he was getting off on this feeling like he could say anything to us and we were a captive audience.
Because women have no power. It's not like these women could have gone and done something about it. Like, even if they complained to their husbands, what would have happened? Nothing. Of course, nothing.
I mean, what would the husbands do about it?
No, nothing.
Tell their wives, oh no, honey, you don't have to be sexually available no matter what.
Ugh.
Oh no, honey, you shouldn't feel obligated to be super sexy all the time. And if I cheat on you, it's not your fault. So like are men really going to be like, are these IFB men going to be good guys like that? No, of course they're not. Schaap is making a literal army of Stepford wives, and this directly benefits the husbands. So even if the wives did complain to their husbands, the men don't have any incentive at all to fight it other than being a decent human being.
But even if these men didn't want their wives liberated, they must have had daughters. I mean, I know like the IFB preachers are like the IFB preaches all sorts of woman-hating theological nonsense. But like there have to have been some men in this situation who would have like had their wives tell them about what Jack Schaap said and realized that there was something very wrong going on here.
So, I mean, I don't know, but here's my guess for how I think this played out. Many wives just accepted what he said and did it without saying anything to their husbands because, like, this is the pastor, like, what he says I'm supposed to do. And, you know, the husbands just, like, got this boost in attention from their wife and never really thought anything of it. I think there were definitely wives who did tell their husbands. So if the husband was sold out to the IFB, First Baptist Church, he would see it as, you know, this is the best thing for my marriage. This is the way that God made things to be. My wife is showing that she loves me by submitting to me and God. And along the same lines, I think that these fathers are thinking that their daughters are going to be blessed to be that same submissive wife to another man one day. Because these people have been sold, like, this is God's perfect plan for your relationship. This is the only way to be happy in marriage. So they believed it.
I mean, this just seems so wild to me. Like, I've got to ask, so like, when you heard this, did you believe that this was your duty? Because you were pretty sold out at this point.
Yeah, I did. I did see this as my duty in marriage eventually. But more than that, like, I saw, like, this is all that marriage could ever be for me. This is all that life will ever be for me, is being subservient to men. Like, I knew that I would never be able to choose how I dressed or where I lived or what I did, because all of those decisions would be made by God through my husband and my pastor.
And this is par for the course as a woman in the IFB, that you aren't so much a person with your own agency, but you're an object or like an asset to be treasured or protected or utilized or kept away from any sort of dangerous or compromising situation. You know, like a watch or a house, or so you're like basically a living, breathing family heirloom.
Yeah, I think that's dead on. It is the pinnacle of objectification, because I think when we talk about feminism and feminist theory, we define objectification more narrowly. Like when a man looks at you and just sees a collection of body parts that he finds attractive and not a person. Like that's objectification. When a man sees you as a collection of parts or like a living sex toy of some kind. Like, yes, that's objectification. But so is seeing a living, breathing person as an asset, as a baby-making machine. Like that is also objectification when you are treated like an asset. Like, I usually say like a car. Like,
yeah,
you feel like as a woman in the IFB,
you're an appliance.
Yes, absolutely. You can absolutely get the impression that your life is worth about as much as like a nice new car. Like, I don't know, like a new Honda Accord. Like a decent new car. Like, not like a Rolls Royce. Oh, no. Not like a Mercedes, but you're like a Honda, like you're like a Honda Accord. Yeah. Base model Impreza. Sure. Wow. Yeah, so all of this, and I can't speak for anyone else's experience, but I absolutely believe that I was less of a person, less of a human than a man. So I think that it's good to end this episode here, because I think that this is the point, I think, where it's most relevant in the story arc, because it sets up basically what's going to be happening next. Mm-hmm. Because how I see it, this ministry under Jack Schaap is the logical conclusion to the ministry under Jack Hyles in particular. That everything that's been leading up to this point, basically from 1959 until basically where we are in the story around 2009, 2010, a lot of the things have stayed pretty much the same in the cult. So the same like repressive doctrines, the same like
anachronistic interpretation of various scripture passages, like the same narcissism, the same like financial double dealing. I mean, the same need to separate people from the outside world. But like one thing that I've seen in particular get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And that's with regards to the way that women are treated within this cult. I like in America, and I think that for most of the world, things aren't like 100% perfect for women, but I don't feel like I should need to say that. But
Yeah.
there has been a lot. Yeah, there's been a lot of progress made over the past like 50 to 60 years. Like things are better now that they're not where they should be, but they're better now than they used to be. But in the IFB, how I'm seeing is that they see that progress and they need to go backwards, especially with this idea that we keep talking about of separation from the outside world. And this is embodied within the behavior of the cult's leadership. So from the 60s through the 80s, we got to see Jack Hyles have extramarital affairs, be verbally abusive towards his wife, be a gaslighter, a manipulator, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then we saw David Hyles, Jack Hyles' son, Next Generation, and things get a whole lot worse. And with David Hyles, he's committing sex crimes, he's having tons of affairs, he's physically abusive. However, while the church is not directly responsible for this, they are active in the cover-up for his crimes and for his behavior.
Right. There is an active cover-up. You're right about that.
Now, with the Jack Schaap ministry, I'll tell you what I'm seeing. And I am seeing a switch from the church excusing away and tolerating and turning a blind eye to this sort of violence against women to this church. And I don't know why I keep calling it a church, because I really just need to keep calling it a cult. But I see this cult laying the foundations to actively being involved in the perpetration of abuse. It started with Jack Hyles. This final phase of it started in the 90s, I think, with Jack Schaap, with Dating with a Purpose, with that dating manual that he put out in the 90s, in which young people were conditioned to accept this idea that the cult would take a more active role in their relationships and their sexuality, and continued on to where we see Jack Schaap and men of his ilk pushing their personal sexual preferences onto every woman who is a cult member. And remember, in episode 4, in the dating episode, they had a class at Hyles Anderson about quote unquote Christian womanhood. And the ideal woman was to look like Jack Schaap's wife and how he wanted a woman to look.
Uh-huh.
Then here we are now in this story, in this situation of where Jack Schaap is in a room full of women alone, basically him and a bunch of women alone, telling them the ways that they need to be sexually available. I think that when we come back into the next episode of this series in 2 weeks for the final part about Jack Schaap's downfall, the IFB's treatment of women and the steady degradation of the IFB's treatment of women, in my opinion, is the primary cause for that downfall.
I think that is a super good take, because
I'm sorry, I went on for a while about that.
That is okay. I was interested listening to you, because I think if you look at the way that people spoke, and if you I've just been digging into these sermons. So side note, Jack Hyles sermons are weirdly soothing to me to listen to, because I listened to them all the time as a kid.
Wow.
So it actually doesn't weird me out to listen to Hyles sermons all day long. Schaap sermons will give me nightmares, because I still have nightmares about him.
He's a weirdo.
But yes, Hyles Hyles would never put down a woman. Hyles was very an old-fashioned gentleman kind of guy on the outside. That's how he portrayed himself. And Hyles would put down and humiliate and mock male staff members.
But it was emasculating. Right.
And where we get to is Schaap did that only in private. So Schaap was really well known for having a filthy mouth and cussing people out in staff meetings and dropping all kind of curse words that these people barely even knew. Schaap was super well known for that. And I'll tell you, I heard stories about Schaap cussing people out in staff meetings before 2012. I was still in high school when I was hearing these stories about him. Oof. From people who had worked for him.
And that in the IFB, that's oh man, this guy's real.
Yeah, he only got away with that because he was super high level. But anyway, Schaap is known for degrading and humiliating, mocking men in private, but he never did that in public. In public, he is always about like women being submissive, women following the dress standards, and like very there's a clip I want to play in a minute about some things that he said about women. He not only got attention from inside the IFB, he got a lot more attention from outside the IFB about some things that he said about women. The clip that I want to play you got him attention from outlets as national as ABC's 2020.
Wow.
So, take a listen to this clip.
ABC News called me this week and said, we heard that you believe that men should be in charge of their wives. I said, no, sir, I didn't say that. I said, God said that. He said, husbands are the head of the wife. I said, if you got a problem with what I said, I was quoting the Bible, maybe I'll take it up with God. He says, do you think that's appropriate? I said, son, anything God says is appropriate, and you better get that straight right now. I never apologize for standing where God stands. I never worry standing where God stands. Somebody says, you know what they're going to say about you? Who cares? Stand in line, pick a number, slob. Get your little squirt gun out and squirt away. Bigger things to worry about. Heaven, hell, life, death. The Bible, what people say about you? Not at all. If they're quoting me while I'm quoting the Bible, hallelujah, God's word is getting out. Don't you ever worry about your pastor being rattled or worried or unsettled or unnerved. I sleep fine. Too many people worried about somebody the other day asked me, this reporter, he said, I heard that that it'd be a cold day in hell before you get your theology from a woman. He says, don't you kind of think that's demeaning to the genders? I says, ask Adam what he thought about getting his theology from a woman. I said, it damned the whole world. I said, the reason your soul's going to hell is because a woman told Adam what God thinks about things. He says, you're pretty strong about what you believe. I said, not half as strong as what God knows you ought to believe. I wouldn't get my theology from a woman. I don't mind if mama teaches the kids. I don't mind if a strong lady and a wise woman and a gracious, godly woman takes the lesson from the pastor. Hey, you listen to me right now? I still believe it'd be a cold day in hell before I get my theology from a woman. I'm a preacher. I wasn't mama called, papa sent. No woman ever got me involved in the ministry. I didn't follow a woman in the ministry. A woman didn't write this book. Not one woman wrote the scriptures right here. A man wrote the Bible, got it from God. A man hung on the cross. His name is Jesus Christ, and God called a man to lead the church here. Hey, I'm glad I'm a man. So many of you got nervous. So the preacher on the news. Praise the Lord, the Word of God is being quoted. More than some of you are doing about getting the Word of God out. I don't care about being politically correct. I don't care who had hair lips. I don't care if it bothers everybody from the White House or the old man sitting in the outhouse. I want to know what's going on in the church house, and I'm the messenger of the church, and what I say is more important than what the news reporter thinks I ought to say. God didn't call him to tell me what to do, and God didn't call anybody else either. You know, if that's arrogant, so be it. The problem is it's the truth in the scriptures here.
And if you ever wanted to know what the IFB thought about women, there's your answer.
Yeah, and I was there when he said that. Just in case you were wondering, I could probably take you to the exact seat I was sitting in. I was on the, stage.
If we put a video up, you'll be able to see the back of your head.
Possibly if the camera's if the camera's at the right angle. No, I was stage left, audience right, front section of the auditorium, close to the back of that front section. So almost like where the balcony comes over, but I could point you exactly where I was sitting.
Wow.
I was there.
So I think with that, we're going to end this episode. We will come back in 2 weeks from now, and that'll be part 5. And this is basically like, up till now, this has been like the calm before the storm almost. The real fireworks are going to start in that episode when we do that one, because... And that'll take us up to the present day, and where Sadie is going to get to talk about the ongoing efforts related to this and the fact that she has actually gotten to be a part of. So stay tuned for that. Until next time. Yeah.
Next week is super exciting to me because next week is entirely things that I was there for. Just all my own personal stories about this man. Next week, I also have some audio for you. I have an audio recording from inside a cult that was not made public and was never supposed to get out. So I hope that you enjoyed that. And then I also get to talk about quite a bit of things that I was actually there for, and what I'm doing now. So
wow.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm bubbling over. I'm super excited about the next episode in the series.
This is exciting, and you will want to tune in for that one. That's going to be in 2 weeks, but next week we're going to talk about some normal stuff. As
Normal.
always, you can find this podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Leaving Eden Podcast. I think on Twitter it's at Leaving Eden Pod. If you've got questions, if you've got, anything you want to know about, you can send us an email at leavingedenpod@gmail.com. If you want to find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, I'm Gavri'el Hacohen, Gavriel Sadie?
You can find me on Instagram at Sadie Carpenter Music and on Twitter at Hell Yeah Sadie.
And that's where we're going to end it. I hope that you guys have a nice day and be sure to tune in next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
But old rolling river tide healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion.